There's a detail in the book of Genesis that leaves everyone who reads it utterly baffled. There were giants on the earth, but who exactly were these giants? How could the sons of God have united with the daughters of men and produced such offspring? This strange and thought-provoking story, has it been hinting at an ancient cosmic struggle between heaven and earth? This question has intrigued theologians and curious minds for centuries. Come, let's explore the great truth hidden behind these seemingly contradictory verses together. Within the sacred pages of the Bible, there are verses that, despite their brevity, carry profound meaning, ignite endless questions, and truly challenge the human mind. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, are precisely like this. This brief passage holds one of the greatest, perhaps even one of the most unsettling mysteries in human history, bringing forth the concept of the Nephilim for the very first time. Yet, it doesn't merely speak of the existence of giants. It also delves into the reasons that led to Noah's flood and the radical decision God made regarding humanity. The story begins in a period when mankind started to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born. Everything seems to be progressing normally, appearing as a natural consequence of demographic growth, when suddenly, an unexpected and shocking event is recounted. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took as wives whomever they chose. This verse seems to whisper that a boundary between the celestial and the earthly, the sacred and the profane, has been crossed. But who were these sons of God? Were they figures who fundamentally altered the course of human history, overturning a divine order? And what did their union with the daughters of men signify? Was this a simple act of marriage, or was it the product of a cosmic rebellion, defying God's divine commands, perhaps even creation itself? If these beings were spiritual angels, how could they have taken on physical bodies and engaged in such intimate relationships with humans? Was this a desecration of holiness, or was it the very distortion of nature itself, irreversibly twisted? These questions aren't just theological debates, they bring with them an existential unease. Immediately following this union, a divine declaration is made. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal, their days will be 120 years. This statement indicates that God's patience had reached its limit, that humanity was drowning in a swamp of sin, and that a major response was being issued against the disruption of divine order. Was this a reaction to humanity's sin, or a cosmic judgment against the direct intervention of divine beings? And did the phrase, "their days will be 120 years, refer to the coming of the flood, implying a 120-year grace period for repentance? Or was it a declaration that human lifespans would gradually shorten after Adam, diminishing from their antediluvian longevity? This ambiguity only deepens the mystery, suggesting that God's decision was multifaceted and profound. And then comes the most striking statement: the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. In those days refers to the period when these dramatic events unfolded, while and also afterward provides a shocking clue that the Nephilim, or at least similar giant beings, reappeared even after the flood. Does this mean that Noah's flood didn't completely cleanse everything? If so, how could these giants have survived or reappeared? Could their legacy or influence somehow have persisted despite the devastation of the flood? These questions raise new inquiries about the scope of the flood and the nature of God's judgment. This 4-verse passage in the book of Genesis is not merely a story of giants, it's a turning point in human history, where God's justice, humanity's fall, a cosmic struggle, and perhaps the first signs of a spiritual war were declared. So, what were the consequences of this union? How did the emergence of the Nephilim impact God's divine plan for humanity? And what profound clues does this event offer us for understanding why Noah's flood was inevitable, signifying not just a moral but also a genetic and spiritual cleansing? The answers, as we peel back the layers of centuries-old theories, might genuinely surprise you. This narrative isn't just an ancient myth, it's a timeless warning that holds clues to the origins of our own existence and our spiritual battles. Let's continue to unravel the layers of this mystery, because sometimes the greatest secrets are hidden behind the shortest verses. The phrase sons of God, or B'nai Ha-Elohim in Hebrew, stands as one of the most debated, interpreted, and perplexing expressions in the entire Bible. For centuries, theologians, scholars, and curious minds have striven to decipher its true meaning. 3 primary interpretations have emerged, each offering a distinct lens through which to view this enigmatic passage in Genesis, while simultaneously possessing both strong merits and inherent weaknesses. This is, without a doubt, the most dramatic, most mysterious, and most imagination-capturing interpretation. According to this theory, the B'nai Ha-Elohim literally refers to sons of God as celestial beings, namely, angels. However, these angels abandoned their divine dwelling, transgressed the heavenly order, descended to earth, and captivated by the beauty of human women, engaged in physical unions with them. The result of these forbidden unions was the Nephilim, a hybrid, anomalous, and colossal offspring. This theory points to a grand cosmic rebellion against God's created order. Pillars of this theory. The strongest historical and theological basis for this theory is found in apocryphal Jewish texts, particularly the Book of Enoch, especially untold Enoch. Though not part of the canonical Bible for most Jewish and Christian traditions, it was widely read and influential in the centuries leading up to and during the time of Jesus and the early church. The Book of Enoch elaborates on the events of Genesis 6, describing 200 watchers, a class of angels, who descended to earth. They engaged in illicit unions with human women, teaching humans forbidden knowledge such as metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, and warfare. From these unions, giants, the Nephilim, were born, who filled the earth with violence, oppression, and corruption. The Book of Enoch even names the leaders of these angels, like Azazel. This text presents this event as the primary cause for the explosion of evil and violence on earth, thereby justifying God's decision to bring Noah's flood. Many early Jewish and Christian writers, while not necessarily recognizing Enoch as canonical, largely agreed with its interpretation of Genesis 6. The New Testament contains passages that seem to allude to this theory. For instance, the Epistle of Jude, Jude 1:6, states, "And the angels who did not keep their own domain but abandoned their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day." Similarly, Peter 2:4 mentions, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment." These verses clearly indicate that fallen angels committed a kind of first sin and were subsequently punished. Many theologians strongly argue that this first sin refers to the events in Genesis 6. The angels abandoning their proper dwelling could well refer to their leaving their heavenly realm to unite with humans on earth. The Hebrew word Nephilim derives from the root naphal, meaning to fall, which can be interpreted as the fallen ones or those who fell. This etymology supports the theory by associating them with angels who fell from heaven. Challenges and counter-arguments to this theory. The primary counter-argument revolves around the spiritual nature of angels, who are typically described as sexless or bodiless beings. In Matthew 22:30, Jesus states that in the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. This verse suggests that angels do not engage in sexual relations or procreate. However, this doesn't necessarily mean angels cannot temporarily assume physical bodies. In the Old Testament, angels appear in human form, visiting Abraham, rescuing Lot, and even eating food. Perhaps these angels, in this specific instance, took on physical forms to achieve their illicit desires. If this theory is true, this union was not merely a biological reproduction, but a perverse mixture between the sacred and the profane, the celestial and the earthly. This constituted a horrific violation of divine order and a distortion of creation itself. The reason for God sending Noah's flood as such a global and devastating judgment could be to cleanse not only human sin, but also this cosmic and spiritual corruption that had infiltrated the earth. This theory best explains the concept of giants in the Bible and God's severe reaction, but it does raise complex theological questions about the nature of angels. This theory interprets the phrase B'nai Ha-Elohim in a more earthly context. According to this view, the sons of God are powerful human rulers, kings, nobles, or tyrants on earth. These rulers either considered themselves divine or acted as if they were representatives of God, bestowing upon themselves a divine status. They were symbols of unbridled power and authority. The daughters of men, on the other hand, were ordinary women from the general populace, often weak and vulnerable. Pillars of this theory. The Hebrew word Elohim, while most commonly referring to God, can occasionally be used to refer to human rulers or judges. Psalm 82:6, where Elohim can be translated as gods or divine beings, but refers to human judges. God takes his stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers/gods. According to this interpretation, sons of God could mean sons of rulers, sons of the powerful, or sons of nobles. These kings or nobles, abusing their positions and power, forcibly took the weak and vulnerable daughters of men as wives, perhaps even subjecting them to sexual slavery. The children born from these unions were not necessarily literal giants in stature, but were renowned for their power, tyranny, and ruthlessness, heroes or giants in the sense of powerful, oppressive leaders. This interpretation can be seen as a critique of corrupt human authority. Supporters of this theory argue that Genesis 6 is part of a broader narrative detailing the moral decline of Cain's lineage. Cain's descendants made worldly advancements like metallurgy through Tubal-Cain, music through Jubal, and city building named after Enoch, but also progressed in violence, Lamech's vengeful song. This interpretation attributes the cause of Noah's flood to the general moral corruption and injustice of humanity, especially among its leaders. It emphasizes the destructive potential of human sin on its own. Challenges to this theory. The primary weakness of this theory lies, once again, in the meaning of the word Nephilim, which typically denotes literal physical size and an anomalous lineage. Merely being famous or powerful might not fully explain why they were given such a specific and mysterious name, or why their existence triggered such a grand divine judgment. If it were solely about human kings, why would the Bible use such dramatic language? And why would God so cosmically declare that his spirit will not contend with humans forever, and that their days will be 120 years? If it was merely a moral issue, why would God's response be so universal and devastating? While Elohim can sometimes refer to humans, the context in Genesis 6, immediately preceding and following discussions of divine intervention and a global flood, leans more towards a non-human interpretation for sons of God. This theory interprets the Bnei Elohim as referring to the descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, who were devoted to God. After Cain killed Abel, God gave Adam Seth, and from this lineage emerged those who began to call on the name of the Lord, signifying a line of believers. The daughters of men, in this interpretation, are considered to be the descendants of Cain, who had drifted away from God and focused on worldly desires, wealth, power, and self-centeredness. Pillars of this theory. The book of Genesis describes the development of two distinct lineages after Adam. Cain's line, marked by worldly progress and increasing violence, and Seth's line, characterized by calling on God's name and spiritual devotion. This theory views the union in Genesis 6 as the intermarriage between the godly line, sons of Seth, and the ungodly line, daughters of Cain, leading to the corruption of the believing lineage. Such mixed marriages are a recurring theme in the Bible, often criticized and forbidden by God's laws to Israel, e.g., Deuteronomy 7:3-4, prohibiting Israelites from intermarrying with pagan nations. This interpretation warns of spiritual compromise and the dilution of faith from generation to generation. Supporters of this theory also explain why Noah's family was spared from the flood. Noah remained righteous in his generation and was not corrupted by these mixed marriages. He was a man who walked with God and maintained the purity of his lineage in a spiritual sense. According to this view, the Nephilim, even if not physically gigantic, were morally and spiritually corrupt individuals who pursued power and renown. They were representatives of a generation that had turned away from God and followed their own desires, leading to rampant wickedness. Challenges to this theory. This theory requires interpreting sons of God as godly men, which, while plausible, is less common than its use for angels or beings with a special divine connection elsewhere in the Bible, e.g., Job 1:6-2. The use of such a distinct term specifically for Seth's descendants raises some questions in the textual context. The biggest challenge for this theory remains the word Nephilim. This term generally refers to physical magnitude and an anomalous lineage. It may not fully capture the meaning if it only signifies morally corrupt individuals, and it seems to conflict with other biblical descriptions of giants like in Numbers 13:30. Regardless of which interpretation one leans towards, the central point conveyed by these verses is clear. The moral and spiritual corruption of humanity had reached such a profound level that it grieved God deeply and compelled him to make a radical decision. So how did these unions become so influential? And how did the emergence of the Nephilim jeopardize God's divine plan for humanity? This in-depth analysis takes us beyond merely asking who to grappling with why and the complex nature of divine justice. This isn't merely a history lesson, it's a reflection of the ancient and ongoing struggle between good and evil that humanity continually faces. All three theories hold significant weight in biblical interpretation. The first theory tends towards a more literal reading of the text, while the others seek more metaphorical or symbolic meanings. However, beyond all these debates, what Genesis 6 ultimately tells us is this: wickedness on earth had reached a point where divine intervention became inevitable. Whether the source of this wickedness was fallen angels, tyrannical kings, or the intermarriage of believers and unbelievers, the outcome was the same: profound corruption. And this corruption had deeply wounded God's heart. So, what exactly was the nature of these giants and their destructive impact? And what did God's reaction to this situation mean for humanity? Let's continue to peel back the layers of this story. Now let's get to the core question. What exactly did Nephilim signify, and what did their existence mean for humanity? The Hebrew word Nephilim is derived from the root naphal, meaning to fall, which can be interpreted as the fallen ones, or those who have fallen. This etymology, if the sons of God were indeed fallen angels, establishes a strong connection with their fall from the heavenly realm to the earth. However, it can also signify a general moral and spiritual decline of humanity. They were, in essence, representatives of a generation that had fallen in both physical and spiritual senses. The Bible describes the Nephilim as heroes and men of renown from ancient times. This description emphasizes not only their physical prowess but also perhaps their tyranny, oppression, and negative impact on society. They were likely leading warriors, rulers, or oppressive figures of their era. They probably possessed physical strength, resilience, and perhaps even intelligence far beyond that of ordinary humans. This would have enabled them to wield immense authority and exert overwhelming pressure on people, making it easier for them to impose their will. However, this renown was generally associated with violence, pride, injustice, and defiance of God. Their presence had filled the earth with bloodshed and oppression. Was the existence of the Nephilim merely a physical threat, or was it also a tangible symbol of spiritual corruption? Genesis 6:5 unequivocally answers this question, indicating that the issue was far from purely physical. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. This verse directly links the emergence of the Nephilim to the general moral and spiritual collapse of humanity. It's as if the birth of these hybrid beings catalyzed the wickedness that already existed, escalating violence and leading humanity further away from God. The earth seemed to descend into a swamp of chaos, anarchy, and anti-holiness. Their very existence was a painful testament to how far God's created world had strayed from its intended purpose. This dire situation grieved God deeply and compelled him to make a radical decision: Noah's flood. The phrases "the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled" reflect a divine sorrow and profound love for humanity. God could not tolerate the pervasive corruption of his own creation. The Nephilim represented the pinnacle of this corruption, the embodied abnormalities defying divine order. As a perverse mixture of human and divine, they fundamentally contradicted God's purpose in creation. Their existence was a direct challenge to God's holiness and will. Therefore, it was inevitable for God to take a drastic step to eliminate this threat. So how were these giants able to be so influential, and why did they leave such a profound impact on humanity? Their physical strength, abnormal size, and perhaps semi-divine origins might have granted them immense authority and oppressive power over ordinary humans. People might have felt not only fear, but also a kind of admiration or submission in their presence. This situation further propagated injustice, violence, and a lifestyle detached from God within society. They reigned as tyrants in their time, disrespecting God's creation. However, the mystery doesn't end here. The word Nephilim does not appear solely in Genesis 6 in the Bible. This provides a shocking clue that their legacy, or similar beings, persisted even after the flood. If so, did the flood truly cleanse all wickedness? Or does it suggest that a cosmic struggle did not conclude with the flood? And how did God's plan contend with this continuous threat? These questions indicate that the story of the Nephilim is not merely an ancient narrative confined to the past, but points to deeper layers of divine justice and the struggle for redemption. Their story offers us a unique perspective to understand humanity's ancient struggle with sin and how God intervened in this conflict. This is not just a history lesson, it is a timeless warning that holds clues to the origins of our own existence and our spiritual battles. Their story also reveals how deeply God's heart was broken by sin and how immense his love is for his own creation. Following the emergence of the Nephilim and humanity's moral and spiritual collapse, God regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. This expression conveys a divine sorrow and a profound love for humanity, while also demonstrating God's absolute intolerance for sin. God could not endure such pervasive corruption in his own creation, and therefore decided to bring Noah's flood. The flood wiped out all living beings on earth, including the Nephilim. This is generally accepted in mainstream biblical interpretations. The flood was an act of purification to cleanse the old world from sin and defilement, establishing a clean slate for a new beginning. Noah and his family were preserved as the seeds of this purified world. However, the story doesn't end here. Instead, it deepens, adding another layer of mystery. The Bible provides shocking clues that the Nephilim reappeared even after the flood. In Numbers chapter 13 verse 33, after the Israelite spies scouted the land of Canaan, they reported back to Moses, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim." This statement refers to giants encountered by the Israelite nation in the Promised Land, approximately 1,500 years after the flood, during Moses' time. How was this possible? Did the flood not destroy everything? Is this a major contradiction, or a more subtle, overlooked detail in the narrative? This makes us ponder the scope of the flood and the nature of God's judgment. Several possible and controversial explanations have been proposed for this situation. If the Nephilim were physical beings, how did they reappear after the flood? According to this theory, the genetic legacy of the Nephilim might have persisted within the genetic makeup of one of Noah's family members, perhaps Ham, or his descendants. There could have been a flaw or residual genetic trait in their DNA that, after the flood, reactivated, leading to the birth of abnormally large individuals. The Anakim mentioned in Numbers 13:33, as well as other giants frequently mentioned in the Bible like Goliath from the Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim, Og, could be seen as a continuation of this lineage. This interpretation implies that despite the physical destruction of the flood, the corrupting genetic influences were not entirely eradicated. So, was God's purification operation not completely successful? Or does this demonstrate how deeply rooted humanity's genetic corruption truly was? And why would God allow such a remnant to persist? Perhaps this was an inevitable consequence of humanity's fallen nature. Although less popular and quite speculative, some commentators suggest that another rebellion of the sons of God or a similar union might have occurred after the flood. This could explain the reference in the book of Numbers. We saw the Nephilim there. However, the Bible does not provide a direct account of such an event after the flood, which weakens this theory. Does the absence of a detailed biblical account mean it didn't happen, or simply that the author's focus was elsewhere? This is an approach adopted by many contemporary theologians. According to this theory, the word Nephilim in Genesis 6 might have referred to a specific hybrid lineage, if the angelic theory is correct. But in Numbers 13 and other passages, Deuteronomy 2:10-11, 20, Joshua 15:8, 2 Samuel 21:16-22, it was simply used to describe people of unusually large stature, or giants. So the giants encountered after the flood were not the hybrid Nephilim of Genesis 6, but merely unusually large humans. This interpretation acknowledges the existence of giants in the Bible, while preserving the cleansing power of the flood, and avoiding the need for complex and speculative theories like genetic inheritance or a new angelic rebellion. These giants were ordinary, albeit physically imposing, humans who opposed God and stood in the way of Israel. Regardless of which theory one favors, the existence of the Anakim and other giants presented a major test of faith for the Israelites. One of the main reasons they hesitated to enter the Promised Land was their fear of these giants. This suggests that these physically enormous beings also sowed seeds of spiritual fear and doubt. They were not merely obstacles but challenges that tested their trust in God's power. Did this situation indicate that a cosmic struggle did not end with the flood? It appears that the seeds of evil could somehow persist on earth despite God's cleansing actions. But how did God's plan of salvation contend with this continuous threat? These questions indicate that the story of the Nephilim is not just an ancient narrative confined to the past, but points to deeper layers of divine justice and the struggle for redemption. Their story offers us a unique perspective to understand humanity's ancient struggle with sin and how God intervened in this conflict. This is not just a history lesson, it is a timeless warning that holds clues to the origins of our own existence and our spiritual battles. The story of these giants calls us to refocus on God's sovereignty and His unwavering will to redeem fallen humanity. So what profound lessons can we draw from this ancient story for our modern lives? The story of the Nephilim is not merely an ancient mystery or an antiquated mythological narrative. Rather, it provides invaluable, timeless lessons about the depths of human nature, divine judgment, God's holiness, and the spiritual battle that has continued throughout the ages. These giants became a tangible symbol of corruption, defiance against divine order, the trampling of human dignity, and a horrific distortion of God's purpose in creation. Their story serves as a painful reminder of how destructive sin can be, how severe and long-lasting the consequences of violating divine laws can be, and that God's patience has its limits. So, could the legacy of the Nephilim extend to our modern day? Of course, they may not be physically roaming among us as giants. However, don't the spiritual corruption, pride, tyranny, injustice, and defiance of divine order that they represented manifest powerfully in our contemporary world? Today, humanity's tendency to elevate its own power and wisdom above God's, to turn science and technology into idols, to disregard the sanctity of human life, to normalize sexual immorality, to escalate violence and injustice, and to embrace ideologies that deny human sacredness, could all of these be modern manifestations of the corruption seen in Genesis 6? It's as if every generation is compelled to face its own Nephilim. This ancient story serves as a perpetual call to vigilance, inviting us to ask ourselves, the events in Genesis 6 demonstrate that sin is not merely an individual act, but can have a domino effect, corrupting an entire society, and even all of creation. The smallest moral deviation over time can lead to catastrophic and irreversible consequences. Aren't the global injustices, environmental disasters, and societal upheavals we witness today direct results of humanity's sin and its disregard for God's principles? God's reaction to the Nephilim and the events that led to their emergence starkly reveals His absolute holiness and unwavering justice. God does not overlook sin, nor does He tolerate evil, and sooner or later, He will execute His justice. This is an immutable part of His character. This truth calls us to profound reverence and awe in the face of God's nature. If the sons of God were fallen angels, this narrative suggests that there is not only a physical, but also an invisible, ongoing spiritual battle being waged on earth. Satan and fallen angels have consistently sought to disrupt God's plan, corrupt humanity, and capture souls throughout the ages. This is a battle we face every day, whether we are conscious of it or not. Therefore, spiritual vigilance and dependence on God are of vital importance. The story of the Nephilim offers profound lessons about human free will and the consequences of the choices made with that will. Even when interacting with divine beings, humans bear responsibility for their own decisions. Humanity's role in the proliferation of evil and corruption should never be overlooked. Our choices, just like Adam and Eve's, have the power to affect not only ourselves but also the world around us. Despite all this chaos, corruption, and divine judgment, God has never abandoned humanity. Noah's flood, though an act of judgment, was also an act of salvation. The preservation of Noah and his family demonstrates God's infinite mercy and his constant provision of a way out for fallen humanity. By eliminating the Nephilim, God ensured the continuation of his plan of salvation. This shows that God's faithfulness and love are even greater than humanity's sinfulness. Today, aren't pride, greed, violence, injustice, and self-centeredness the very same fundamental sins that filled the earth during the time of the Nephilim? In our modern world, the attempts to put technology and science in God's place, the disregard for the sanctity of human life, the normalization of sexual immorality, the pursuit of power and fame at all costs, could all these be different, perhaps more sophisticated, manifestations of the corruption experienced in Genesis 6? The Nephilim were prototypes of those who sought to distort God's creation, and their spirit, in various forms, has continued to emerge throughout the ages. This story serves as a perpetual call to vigilance. Whose path are we following? How much do we value what is holy? And how much respect do we show for God's sovereignty? In our inner world, and in our outer society, how should we stand against the spiritual corruption that the Nephilim represented? How committed are we to shaping ourselves and our surroundings according to God's holy standards? These questions are not just about the past, they are intimately relevant to our lives today and our future. Each of us in our own lives makes a choice about how we confront our giants. The story of the Nephilim continues to be one of the most complex and debated topics in the Bible. While the veil of this ancient mystery may never fully lift, behind this profound narrative lie invaluable, universal truths about humanity's destiny, the proliferation of sin, divine judgment, and God's eternal plan of salvation. Regardless of who they were, their existence caused an unforgivable corruption in God's eyes, demonstrating humanity's desperate need for a radical cleansing, a spiritual transformation, and a new beginning. This leads us to Noah, and from him to the promise of salvation, ultimately paving the way to Christ Jesus. This story has resonated deeply within ancient Jewish and Christian traditions. From rabbinic literature and the interpretations of early church fathers, figures like Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Justin Martyr interpreted the Nephilim as the offspring of fallen angels, to apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch. The figure of the Nephilim has been understood as a symbol of the disruption of divine order, the consequences of a cosmic rebellion, and an ongoing spiritual battle. These diverse interpretations demonstrate how layered the Bible is and how profound the secrets within God's Word are. Each interpretation may hold a piece of the truth, guiding us toward a larger, more comprehensive divine design. This underscores the importance of humility and deep contemplation in interpreting sacred texts. This story is not just an ancient myth, it's a timeless warning that carries clues to the origins of our own existence and our spiritual struggles. God's justice and mercy are strikingly revealed in the story of the Nephilim. Regardless of the depth of sin, God always makes a way for salvation, and Noah's Ark remains an eternal symbol of his saving love. The Nephilim form the dramatic backdrop to this great story of salvation, clearly illustrating how destructive sin can be and how necessary God's redemptive action is. Today, we too face our own giants. Though they may not be physical giants, our inner struggles, societal injustices, spiritual voids, and every form of corruption that pulls us away from God are our contemporary Nephilim. This story reminds us that it is vital to revere God's holiness, obey his commandments, and combat the evil within our own hearts. God, with his heart troubled, has always offered us a way to be rescued from this corruption. So, what do you think? Who are the sons of God, and which theory about the Nephilim resonates most with you? What lessons does this ancient story hold for our world today? What are the giants you face in your own life, and how does this story inspire you to confront them? Share your thoughts, questions, and reflections in the comments below. Every single comment enriches this important conversation and helps more people delve into the depths of the Bible. Remember, in God's Word, there are always new discoveries and profound meanings to be found. If you love exploring the mysteries behind ancient stories like this one, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell. Each week, we dive deep into the Bible's secrets, history, archaeological evidence, and theological insights. In our next video, we'll delve into the story of another lesser-known but astonishing character from the Bible, perhaps the mysterious Melchizedek. Don't miss it. this journey will take you deeper than you ever imagined, right to the foundations of your faith and worldview. Remember, the Bible doesn't just tell us about the past. It offers us a compass for understanding today and tomorrow, for experiencing spiritual awakening, and for discovering our divine purpose. May God's wisdom, the peace of His Spirit, and the love of His Word always be with you. Stay blessed.